Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to my session. Today we're going to talk about creating a record-driven workflow, and we're using this for two different reasons. Primarily, we want to use this to reduce complexity of our workflow and record producer in our environment. But the second half of this as well is by reducing the complexity of the system, I'm looking to turn this application, turn this process into something that can be managed by our users rather than something that our ServiceNow administrative team has to take care of. So the two highlights here are creating a record-driven workflow to make our process more dynamic, more functional, and while reducing complexity, but also for allowing our business users to maintain an application themselves rather than relying on a ServiceNow administrator to update everything for them. Sure. Is this any better? I could keep talking. That would probably help. So my clicker isn't actually clicking, so I'm going to have to kind of use my mouse over here to proceed with our workflow, presentation. I'm in the wrong mind space already. Are you going to take a crack at that for me? It's for this. Not a big deal. I can just add it. All right. Now we're rolling. So about me, I'm Brian Harris. I am an implementation specialist. I've been working in ServiceNow for about 5 years. I used to be on help desk, and I don't know how to repair PowerPoint clickers anymore. So I've been doing ServiceNow for a little bit too long. So I'm really targeting, I think, kind of a lot of beginner, intermediate level ServiceNow administrators with this session. So I did want to check before I got too far into it. Who here has been on ServiceNow for maybe a year or less? Got a few, 2 years? Okay, cool. So I just wanted to kind of check in before I get started so I know what level I need to work at here. So let's look at the agenda for the session here. So like I said before, what we're really focusing on is the creation of a workflow and a process that's going to be dynamically driven through records in a table in our system rather than having logic statically defined within a workflow or within like a record producer. So in order to provide context for this, I'm going to be kind of demoing an application that I built that required me to actually build out the application this way. So what we're going to start with is a very small application that I created to handle a very simplified version of least privilege access within an organization. So the focus on our presentation here really isn't least privilege access. We're kind of using that to provide context. We're using that to just let us step through this and show how I'm handling an application or a process, and it could be any process, using this type of methodology. So the way it was developed for this client or for this customer is extremely simplified. It's really not best practice for least privilege access, so definitely don't rely on me for teaching you how to do it properly, because I'm not the guy for that. So to get into that portion where we actually talk about the workflow, the requirements behind it, we're just going to go through a sample project that provided these requirements to me, the reasoning for why I needed to actually develop this methodology. So we'll talk about the project or the application itself just to get us into that context. And from there, we'll go ahead and talk about the architecture overview, which is what I needed to develop and how I needed to configure our system to actually allow me to handle a workflow this way. Then we'll move into our demo and then kind of talk about the results and benefits of the architecture. So what we're hoping to take away from today's session, first of all, we want to go ahead and define what a record-driven workflow is. We've talked about that a little bit. When I say record-driven workflow, what I really mean is that I'm creating a workflow that will be flexible enough to handle a variety of situations, a variety of scenarios, but I'm doing that without developing any kind of logic directly in the workflow itself. So my workflow is going to dynamically pull all the data it needs from a record in a table. We're not going to use like any kind of logic statement in our workflow. We don't need an if statement. We don't need a switch statement to handle different scenarios. We're going to handle all of that through the record. So as we talk about, I'm going to continually say record-driven workflow. That's not something I've heard ServiceNow call that before, but so in the context of this presentation, that's what I'm talking about, and that's what we'll be looking at. So we want to decide when would be the right time to use a record-driven workflow. When does that work? When is that going to benefit us? How can we set that up? What would be the right way to develop it? And then finally, the benefits of using it. So we want to talk about when to use it, how to do it, and why we should use it. So getting back to our project here, so this is kind of, like I said, this is a very light implementation of something resembling least privilege access. So this is the user story that was provided to me that kind of started this project and what led me into developing our application. So as a product owner, I want IT staff to be able to request elevated access to my product so that I can approve, audit, and fulfill requests for access. So within the organization I was developing this for, we had this initial story, and then we had a discussion about requirements, and I'll go ahead and put us on that slide. From the user perspective, or for the customer perspective, they were really expecting that we would create a new catalog in our service category to handle access requests. With their understanding of ServiceNow, they thought that I would provide a catalog of multiple requests that are really going to accomplish the same thing, but for a variety of different data sources. And so we're calling these data sources because of the implementation here. When we're allowing people to request access in this environment, they can request access to a server as a whole, a database, some table within a database, or some application within a server. So rather than using specific terminology, we're just kind of leaving it generic and calling this a data source. So just to avoid confusion since we're reusing this throughout the environment. So when I talk about a data source, somebody can be requesting access to pretty much anything within the environment that requires some level of privilege or some level of access to be created. So the client expectation here was that we would build out multiple catalog items per data source. If you want access to the payroll system, you need to fill out the payroll access request form, and we're going to have a workflow for that payroll form. And that workflow is going to define who can approve payroll access, who can fulfill or grant that access. And then we would just continually add and update other sources of data the same way. So the expectation for this is that we're going to just continually build out potentially dozens of different catalog items and matching workflow for each of those items. Even though we're really following the same logic, we're following the same process for each of these. It's just that the specific details for each are going to be different. So if we had built this out this way, and honestly, my first year of doing ServiceNow work, I probably would have done it that way because I just didn't know. So if we had done it this way, we're going to run into an issue of things need to be updated, things need to be changed constantly. We're constantly going into the catalog item, updating our variables, updating our forms, and then immediately going back into our workflow as well and updating the logic there, updating assignment groups, updating approval users, things of that nature. So I started developing this about, I think it's been 1.5 years, maybe 2 years ago. So I was kind of just far enough into my ServiceNow career that I had red flags pop up, and I was like, we totally can build this the way you've requested it. However, that's going to be my full-time job for the rest of my life, is just maintaining this thing as you continue to add stuff in. And I've become a lazy developer. I see things like this, and I just think to myself, there has to be a better way. There has to be a way to get this. Let's consolidate this into one workflow. Let's consolidate this into one form. Let's take the maintenance out of it. Let's let me work on other things, bigger and better things, and let's put the work in up front to make this thing work, make this a successful project, something that can be reused, and something that'll be adaptable. So the project requirements I've actually listed out here are this is also consolidated. This is me rewriting what the customer provided to me. So ignoring how they suggested I actually create the project, let's just look at the actual requirements, what they really need from it. So first of all, it has to be expandable. They're going to provide me with a couple of different data sources to start the project, and the expectation is that we have a couple dozen more that we need to account for eventually, but first of all, we need to make sure that the process works. We need to make sure that the process is going to be adopted by the organization. So once that's done, from their point of view, I'm going to immediately create 20 or 30 more catalog items and workflows. From my perspective, I'm hoping not to. But either way, this has to be accounted for. We're going to continually add things. We're going to continually update things. So no matter how that gets done, that is a requirement of the project, and we do need to find out how to actually accomplish this. Second of all, quick turnaround is going to be important. So we're expecting frequent changes within these data sources. The people who can approve this, they're going to change every other week. The people who will fulfill this, they might change too. The organization that requested this actually had you'll see this in the architecture slides, but they have a habit of assigning single approvers for items such as this, things that are both confidential and super important in the environment. It has a single approver, and that guy goes on vacation sometimes, he leaves. So I get requests to update a workflow for the next 2 weeks, flip the approver over to this other single person, and then at the end, flip it back. So when I talk about turnaround, I'm trying to eliminate that scenario because it's something that is, as an admin, is causing me a lot of stress in the environment already, and it's not being handled well. So we need to be able to account for frequent changes. We need to make that work. We need to make that easy. And if we're not able to do that, the process itself isn't going to get adopted within the organization. People are going to submit requests for access. They're going to go to an approver who isn't there. It's going to sit there for 2 weeks. And they're just going to email somebody instead and say, hey, I need to do this tomorrow. Give me access. The system doesn't work. They're not going to bother using it again if that's their experience. So next up is ease of use. This is getting into the part where I've decided that I'm not going to be the one maintaining it. So my intention here is that the product owner, the person who owns a source of data, they're going to tell me who can approve this, who can fulfill this, and then I'm going to plug that into ServiceNow. So at that point, they're already filling out all the information I need to do this. So this is really where I started kind of focusing on making something record-driven instead. We're not going to let a process owner or a product owner get into a workflow and edit it. That would be terrible. But what I can do is have them submit a record, and we're going to ask for what's the data source, what can a person ask for access to, tell me who can approve it, tell me who can fulfill it. And at that point, if I can make my workflow pull from that record, I don't need to do anything anymore. The end user, by submitting their request for me to add access or add a new source of access to the system, has already done the work themselves, whether they realize it or not. So additionally, I don't think I have a bullet point for it, but from the end user's perspective for ease of use as well, it's pretty similar to the quick turnaround statement of this thing does need to be quick, it needs to be easy. When I'm asking a user to fill out a form to request access for something, and that's a process they didn't need before, it needs to be as easy as sending an email to a guy asking for access, because that's what they're used to. That's what they've been doing for 10 years at this point. So if I'm introducing new hoops to jump through, new process for the sake of having a process, this thing isn't going to be adopted. This thing really isn't going to get very far. So ease of use is going to be important from both aspects, both for the maintenance by the product owner, but also for adoption from the end user. And the final requirement I had was just an audit trail. So again, just in the context of this application being kind of a least privilege access thing, this is actually really what prompted the project itself, is that we can email people, we can ask for access to a system that works, but then we don't have a paper trail. We don't know who had access to what and when. So that's kind of a footnote at the very end, and it's not super important to the presentation or what we're really hoping to discuss here, but at the same time, it is kind of what sparked the entire project. Okay, so at this point, I've decided that I'm not going to create all this logic within a workflow. I'm not going to create multiple catalog items. So I've already decided and convinced our stakeholders in this project that I can do this by building just some new tables in the system and defining these records. I think I can accomplish this. I think it'll be way easier, way slicker than what they asked for. So this is what I've decided I need to actually make this project work. So the most important aspect of all of this is our first table that I'm creating. It's the data source table. So we're going to look at that on the next slide. We'll see all the fields within this table, but at a glance, the data source table is going to hold all of the information for every system of record that an individual can request access for. So everything from the record producer and the workflow that we're going to develop later is driven off of the data source table. I have 3 more tables after that, but for the sake of this presentation, those aren't strictly required for the workflow or for the record producer. That's really specific to this application itself. So to provide the functionality that we actually need to create a record-driven workflow here, all I really need is that one table that holds the data that I care about. So I did create, you're going to see this, there's an access request table, an access task table. These are very similar to the requested item table, to the catalog task table already in ServiceNow, but we're using a smaller subset of mostly custom fields that only apply to this one application or this one workflow. So we decided just to go ahead and put in a new table to present a cleaner view of this. So rather than building out a bunch of UI policies or a bunch of client scripts to change our standard catalog task form into a 6-variable form for our least privilege access implementation, we just went ahead and made custom tables. It'll be cleaner, it'll be quicker, and it'll also provide us room to continue to customize this as the application grows down the line. And our last table is access records, and again, this is for the audit trail. We just have an additional read-only table that's going to log access as it's granted throughout this process. So now that our tables are created, we can set up a workflow, we can set up a record producer. Like we discussed, that record producer is going to pull everything that we need off of the data source table. And when we see the record producer later, it's 3 questions. We're asking who needs access, what they need access to, and why. So from the record producer perspective, the only thing I'm really looking at is just that list of data sources. What data sources are available in the system? What can they actually request access to? Once that record producer is submitted, we're going to kick off a workflow. And the workflow is also looking at that data source table. So all of our approvals are based on the data source record that was defined in the record producer. Fulfiller tasks will be assigned based on the data source record. And we're even defining notification recipients at this point. So like when I submit a request for access, myself as a requester, I will receive a notification that says my request was submitted, it's pending approval. But we're also allowed to define additional notification recipients at that data source record level. And by doing that, we're just allowed to kind of copy on additional people who they're not going to approve it, they're not going to fulfill it, but they probably want to know that, well, I run that database. I would like to know that somebody new is going to be in my environment sometime soon if this thing gets approved. So we've added in the functionality to allow for that within our data source as well. Okay, so we talked about the data source record a little bit, and I thought it would make a little bit more sense to actually show what this is going to look like before we get into the workflow. So this is the data source record. This is what I'm asking the product owner to submit for me. So for me to create a catalog item the way they had wanted, for me to create a workflow the way they had wanted, I need to know, what do I call the thing? What's the name of the data source? This one is payroll system because it's nice and generic and I won't get in trouble with my customer for using it. Who can approve this? And like I said, with this particular customer, they like individual approvers. It's really not best practice. So for approvers and notifications both, you're going to see that I'm allowing for a list of individual approval users, but also a list of approval groups. So my recommendation for anybody else, if you can talk people out of using individual users, try your best. Using groups is way better for maintenance, better for everything. But as a requirement for this one, I needed to account for both and allow for both. So when we get to the workflow stage of this, I'm actually going to take that list of individual approvers, the list of approval groups, and I'm going to merge that into a single list of users. And we're going to do the same thing for the notifications. So really what that's saying is that I have, aside from the data source name, I'm requesting 5 pieces of information. And if we were following best practice, we could change that from 5 down to 3 because we shouldn't be asking for individual notification users. We shouldn't be asking for individual approvers. We really should be using groups for both of those. So we're going to see that. We're going to work based on that for this, for the sake of this project or this presentation. But out in the real world, you probably want to avoid this if you can. So the workflow itself. Like we had talked about, notification recipients, approvers, and fulfillers are all defined on that data source record that we just looked at. And because we're doing it this way, we never need to update this workflow unless the process itself changes. So as we kind of discussed before, when you look at this workflow, we don't have any real logic hard-coded in here. We're not seeing a switch statement based on if the data source is payroll system, branch off over here, we need to go to this approver, we need to go to this fulfiller. If we did that, we would have a switch statement of potentially 30 data sources. I would be in here every day of my life. And additionally, that would kind of create a concern of workflow versioning as well. If I need to change the approver within a workflow today, and we have a request pending from yesterday, and that approver, that fulfiller is defined statically within the workflow, they're on an old version, they're going to go to the wrong approver today, they're going to go to the wrong fulfiller today. And by pulling this from a record, we're doing this at runtime. So when I get to the approval step of this workflow, ServiceNow is checking that data record, it's looking at the data source, and it's saying, right now, today, who's the approver for this? And once it gets approved, we go on to task generation. We're checking with ServiceNow again. We're saying, okay, it got approved. It's been 5 minutes. Has the fulfiller changed? I need to check that data source record. Okay, this is the current fulfiller. Let's assign it to that group. So by doing it this way, we've managed to create, first of all, a very simple workflow. But this is flexible enough to handle any number of data sources that we add to it. I'll never update this workflow unless the actual process changes. If I need to add an extra step in, if I need to do something like that. But we can add and remove and even update data sources all day, every day, and this workflow stays the same. And because we're pulling everything we need at runtime, we're never going to run into an issue of somebody being on an old version or an outdated version of the workflow. We're never going to run into that issue where somebody is getting sent to last week's approver, not this week's approver, or anything like that. So for my next couple of slides, we're actually going to look at, I'm just kind of doing some code samples for how this actually works within the workflow. How are we getting ServiceNow to actually look at that data source record and determine what I need to do? So for my first sample here, we're just looking at pulling in notification recipients from that data source record. And so all these slides are also available after the conference. These can be downloaded off of ServiceNow's digital document library, I believe. So if anybody wants to reference this later, that's something that you can get access to. So like I said before, we're looking at a list of individual users as well as a list of groups. So I have to account for both in my script. So really what I'm doing here is I'm looking at that data source record, I'm pulling it in, I'm checking to see if that list of notification users contains something. If it's blank, I skip it. Otherwise, I get that list of users, and I'm going to push that into an array. And that array is just going to be the final list of email recipients for the notification that we're going to send out. The second block of this script is doing the same thing, but for the notification groups instead. So we're checking to see, are there any notification groups defined on this data source? If there are, we're going to run through each of those groups. We're going to pull out every member of that group and add them into our notification recipient list. And at the end of that, we're just returning that back to the workflow. And we're creating an event that's going to fire off a notification. So I actually didn't talk about this before, but we're creating an event here rather than running an actual notification action in our workflow. And that's really following kind of the same guidelines that I'm trying to follow with the rest of this process or this project. If I defined a notification within the workflow and I had to change the recipients of that, or I had to change the text of that notification, I have to check out the workflow. I have to update it, I have to republish it. People on different versions of the workflow are going to get different versions of the notification. So just for the sake of further, trying to follow best practices here, we've created a notification in ServiceNow's notification module. We can update that on the fly at any time without looking at the workflow, without editing the workflow. So what we're doing here is just creating an event that will trigger that notification outside the workflow, and it'll dynamically pass over the recipient list based on our data source record. And it's hard to tell, but I changed the slide. We're loading in approvers, and it's the exact same thing, except I changed a field name that I'm querying for. So I almost talked myself into removing this slide or maybe fixing my code before showing it, but I feel like this actually brings up a really good point that we should cover. 2 years ago, I wrote a script to find notification recipients, and it worked. When I found out I needed to do the same thing for approvers, I had a script that worked, so I copied it and I pasted it. We shouldn't do that, and I know better now, so I'll go ahead and shame myself a little bit and just say that if we look at this, I'm doing the exact same work multiple times in this workflow. I'm grabbing that glide record for our data source record probably in every step of this workflow. When a notification gets created, I'm grabbing the data source. I'm doing a query, I'm grabbing it. There's only one data source each time this workflow runs. It's the data source that is selected from the record producer. So when I send a notification, I run a query for that data source. When I need approvals, I run a query for the exact same data source. When I create a task, I need to know who to assign it to. I'm going to just query that glide record again. So really, the first few lines of this ought to be moved into a script at the very beginning of our workflow. I should be doing this once. I should look at that data source. I should pull out all of the data, all the fields that I'm going to need throughout the process within this workflow. I should write that to our scratch pad so it'll be available for the duration of our workflow. And then I should never do it again. I'm not going to cause a system outage or a slowdown with something this small by doing a really simple glide record query like that, but I'm still doing the exact same thing 5 different times, and it's just unnecessary, and we really shouldn't be doing that. Likewise, everything I have below this, I'm pulling users out, adding them to a list, sorting groups finding members of a group, adding that to a list, and I'm doing that twice. If I did it wrong or if I ever needed to change it, I have to go into this workflow, I have to change it twice. So already this could have been rewritten as a function. As a developer, the more I learn, this is something that if I had written it out as a function and I ever needed to make a change to it, I could do this once. And beyond that, I kind of think about this now, how many other workflows do I have that I need to do the same thing for? So at this point, not just a function, I should really be defining this in a script include in ServiceNow. At that point, rather than copy pasting a script into a workflow every time I need it, I would actually be enhancing our ServiceNow environment. I'd be creating new functionality that I can call at any time from any workflow, from anywhere else in the environment, and we're going to reuse this functionality. There's no need for me to go back. Anytime I need to do this in the future, I shouldn't have to pull up this workflow, figure out how I did it, and then copy paste it somewhere else. I really should have one line in a script include that just lets me call that and say, like, well, I need to get all the members out of a group again, but I already wrote that function, so let's just say, let's call that, let's do it. And if I ever need to make a change to it, again, we're going to do that in one place inside a client, or sorry, not a client script. We're going to do that inside a script include. We do it once, we never have to worry about it again. Everywhere else in the environment that uses that methodology will immediately be updated. It'll be taken care of and fixed. We won't have to go through and think about, we have 60 workflows in our environment. Which ones did I do that thing to? Which ones do I need to update? What am I going to break when I make those changes to all these individual workflows? So that's what I wanted to leave these slides in here for. Kind of a combination of, this does work. If you need a reference, this is a good starting point, but also for myself and for everyone here, as we're working in ServiceNow, as we're working as developers, really every time I look at something I did in the past, it could be 2 years ago like this, or it could be 2 months ago, I'm going to find something that I would do better today, something I would do different. So I just thought that was worth bringing up and kind of touching on throughout this presentation as well. Okay, so now that we've kind of shown how everything is going to look, or how we're setting this up to actually work, I can walk through a quick demo just to show what the functionality looks like. No, that one. There we go. Okay, so I wanted just to start by showing our record producer. So like I said, I wanted to keep this as simple as possible, and my intention here was to make it, the old process was sending an email to somebody and requesting access. So my goal is to make this as easy, or possibly easier, than sending an email. The one benefit I have is you don't need to know who the approver is or who can fulfill this anymore. All I need to know is who you are, and I'll even fill it in for you, what you need access to, and then why. So from our data source list, I want to go ahead and show this up front. We have 3 data sources currently defined in our application. We have a file server, an HR server, or an HR system, and a payroll system. So since this list is pulling dynamically from our data source table, I can come over to our list of data sources, and again, we have an HR system, a file server, and a payroll system. If we need to add something into this, I'm simply going to ask my product owner to create a new data source record, and they're going to create one called demo. I guess that makes sense. We can add an approver. Fred Luddy likes that kind of stuff. So just to kind of verify how that script works for merging together a group and a list of users, we can actually define multiple groups. I just don't know which of these actually contain users, but let's try it. Okay, notification users. Why not me? And an assignment group. So this is the information I would have been asking the product owner for anyway if they told me I needed to add a new source of data to this request. So instead, we're just granting access to those product owners to come in and submit this themselves. So they've completed this request, or they've entered this record. If I actually pull that back up. So we have 4 records within that table now. If I refresh my record producer, I now have 4 options on the data source field. So immediately, the data source record is available in the system. Our record producer has picked that up, and our workflow is already ready to go. So by having the product owner submit this record, I've taken myself out of the equation. The product owner no longer has to wait for me to manage this. I don't have to add anything to the record producer. I don't have to add anything or change anything on the workflow. It's already getting picked up. So let's go ahead and submit this. Okay, and change it over to default view so we can see everything. Okay, so like I said, the actual request itself is going to be simple. So we have 9 approvers. So we called out Fred Luddy and AbleTutor individually. We wanted them to be approvers on this, and then we also defined a couple of groups. So the script that we walked through earlier is just going to combine all of that into one list of approvers. So my customer requirement here was that only one. It doesn't matter how many approvers we ask. We only need one person to approve or reject. So let's just go ahead and approve this. And if I refresh my task list, we now have a task assigned to the database group because that was the fulfiller we defined on our data source record. So without making any changes to our record producer and without making any changes to our workflow, we can see that everything is being handled on the fly from these records. So anytime I need somebody to come in and create a new data source or update it, let me just, cab approval can fulfill things, why not? And go through my approval step. Okay, so now we've made an update to our data source record. I immediately submit a request for it. The assignment group has changed. Database no longer wants to provide access to the database. They think the cab approval group can do it. I decided that I'm on board with this. We made the change. So here we are. Cab approval is now the fulfiller for this request. So anytime I run this request, anytime I submit a request like this, we're immediately going to go to the most up-to-date information available from our data source record. We're never going to update that workflow. We're never going to update that record producer. Everything is pulled dynamically at runtime from our list of data sources.
So Brian, if there were 15 tickets sitting in the database queue for their action, you went in and you updated the table to now say cab approval, those 15 moved to cab approval? Or do they sit in the database?
If they went through the workflow while database was still the fulfiller, they would stay there. That's actually a really great point and something that we would still run into with this. So as part of this application, we didn't account for it, but we could look at that with like a business rule and say, hey, I noticed a change on the data source record. Do we have any tasks associated with that data source that are still open? If so, we can just reassign them there as well. So that, if you were there in the meetings early on, we would have knocked this out.
Not my first rodeo.
And then the very last step we had on that workflow was just to create a record logging that access. So I'll just kind of show that real quick. Default view on our user record. Oh, right. You've got to close the task. You actually have to, you got to grant the access before the access is logged. We did that on purpose. Yeah. Perfect. So we now have a list of privileged access that's been granted to this user throughout their environment. So if we were to pull this up, everything is read-only except for the status of this access. They didn't want to automate this yet. So the only thing I can change is to say that I've taken this person's access away. And by doing that, we're filling out the disabled date. So from an auditing perspective, from a compliance perspective, we have a list of every time every user has requested access to a source of data and how long they've had that access. If I go back to my user record, we can refresh that and see that this has been filled out. So this can hook into other processes as well. So if we look at transferring or terminating an employee, this list of data access becomes kind of a checklist. This person's leaving the company. They still have right access to the payroll database. Maybe they shouldn't. So we're gonna hook into that later. We're gonna do something with that. Okay. You might click. All right, so that kind of wraps up the demo. So the results and the benefits of building out a workflow this way. Number one, and most important to me, it's maintained by business users. I don't have to do anything anymore. So like we showed, product owners can go in, they can update and, create and update their own data source records. They can define all that information, and I never have to touch the workflow. Accuracy has also been improved. Like we showed, everything is being pulled from that record at runtime. We don't have to worry about workflow versioning issues. We don't have to worry about things going off to the wrong places. So as long as we're keeping these records up to date, the workflow and the record producer are also immediately updated and immediately taking advantage of those changes. So we're going to send everything exactly where we're telling ServiceNow it should go without worrying about that workflow version. And lastly, we have auditing now. Not super important for the presentation here, but as a requirement for the project, we needed that auditing. We're now logging all of the access we're granting, which we weren't before, and we're able to check off on that when we need to make a change to an employee status later on. So next steps on this application itself. If I were to change anything, I'm sure some of you probably noticed this, we're not defining a level of access within a data source. So I just requested access to our entire payroll system, which seems a little bit sketchy. You probably want to ask for, maybe I need read access because I'm doing reporting, I'm doing something like that. Maybe I need write access because I'm performing an integration. So something that's lacking and wasn't really required for go live on this application would just require us to add a new table in. We can create levels of access and associate that with a source of data. And once that's done, we're going to follow the same pattern we had on the rest of this project. A field on the record producer would dynamically update based on the data source selected and automatically pull from this new table. And our workflow would also automatically pick up on that and perform the actions that we need. So even as we add on to this project, as we add on to the scope of the application, we're keeping that maintenance down and hopefully non-existent for the admins. We're going to allow business users to submit these levels of access to on their data sources, and the workflow and the record producer will continue to just update and drive based on that. So our takeaways from the presentation, first of all, when should we use a record-driven workflow? Kind of as we discussed throughout this, it's useful when the underlying data changes frequently. It's also useful if it changes at all. Even if it's infrequent, we can account for it. If we know it's going to happen, you just have to make that decision, like, is this something I expect to grow over time? If so, is it worth me creating a table and running it this way? Or is there a record somewhere that can drive this? And if there is, I think this is a valid approach to take. So the benefits of using this again, we're pulling data from records, and that's ensuring that our information is always up to date And again, we're doing that without maintenance on the admin side. We're not updating the workflow, we're not updating the record producer. It's all generated automatically based on the record that the process owner or the product owner has filled out themselves. And I think I kind of just covered that on point 2 by accident. Our third takeaway, I'm very excited that I'm not maintaining this. I submitted this thing, it went live 2 years ago. I was with the company for a year after that, and I didn't do anything. We increased the number of data sources, we made changes, and by we, I mean somebody other than the ServiceNow admin. So everything worked great, and that's why I wanted to share it as, hopefully that's something we can all kind of look into doing. That's something that I think is a valid approach to take for a lot of ServiceNow administrators and developers. If you have an opportunity to build a workflow a little bit smarter to account for changes that we know are going to come, or just to kind of eliminate that overhead and that maintenance, that's really something we want to focus on up front. It really pays dividends later on throughout your career. You're freeing yourself up to just work on bigger and better projects and more important issues rather than focusing on maintaining that least privilege access app you built 2 years ago. And that's what I've got. So if anybody has any more questions as well.
A quick question. Who would you envision having access to create or update those data source records? Just given that you could have multiple product owners, right?
Yeah. So by default, I didn't touch on this a whole lot, but this was developed as a custom application in ServiceNow's App Studio, and I don't know how familiar everybody is with that here. One of the benefits of that was that it automatically created new roles and new ACLs for those tables I created. So just by creating the table, like ServiceNow, also created a new role that's required to make changes to that table. So kind of by default, in this environment, what we found out was that we had, when I say a product owner, it's probably a director over like the development teams or a director over the infrastructure side. So we're granting a role to people who can account for 50% of what's going to come in. So in my particular case, we were able to grant access to really 3 or 4 different people that we can trust to not step on each other's toes.
That's what I was concerned about.
Yeah, so the next step though, so like you said, we could allow a user to create a new data source record, and we could set up our ACLs to say that only the user who creates it can now update it. The only issue then that I was thinking about is just the ownership changes, and we always have issues with. Same situation. Yeah, it's like the person who is leaving doesn't want to update the record because it's not his job anymore. So that kind of needs to be accounted for. So cases like that, if you wanted to be really strict on it, I probably would set up the security so that the person who submits it can update it, but also have kind of a fallback group of ServiceNow admins or maybe higher level people who can step in and make those changes if needed. Do we have any others?